By the winter of 1847, roads across Western Ireland were lined with bodies, not soldiers, not victims of plague, farmers, mothers, children, people who had done everything right, planted their fields, tended their crops, waited for harvest, and starved anyway, because the one plant standing between them and death had rotted in the ground 3 years running. Before it was over, close to 1 million people would die of hunger and disease in a country that same year continued shipping grain, butter and livestock out to England under armed guard. Another 1 million would flee the country entirely, crammed onto ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden that sailors nicknamed them coffin ships, because so many passengers never survived the crossing. At the center of this catastrophe was not a war, not a drought, not a plague in the traditional sense. It was a vegetable, a lumpy, unglamorous root that, 100 years earlier, most of Europe had refused to even put in their mouths, believing it caused leprosy, madness, and moral corruption. That single crop, in the span of a century, took a nation of 3 million people and grew it to 8 million, and then, in 7 catastrophic years, helped bring that same nation to its knees. To understand how that's possible, you have to go back, nearly 8,000 years before Ireland ever saw a single potato, to a place about as far from Ireland as it's possible to get. High in the Andes, above 12,000 feet, in what's now southern Peru and Bolivia, wild potatoes grew scattered across rock and thin, cold soil, at altitudes where almost nothing else survives. They looked nothing like the potatoes on your plate today. Most were smaller than a golf ball, and nearly all of them were toxic. Wild potatoes are loaded with solanine and tomatine, bitter compounds that cause nausea, vomiting, cramping, and in high enough doses, death. Eating one raw could genuinely kill you, and the people living in these mountains learned that the hard way, generation after generation. But somewhere along the way, they figured out something remarkable. If you soaked the tubers in cold running mountain streams for days at a time, the water pulled much of the poison out. And if you then left the soaked potatoes outside overnight at high altitude, where temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing, and let the intense equatorial sun thaw them again the next morning, repeating that freeze-thaw cycle again and again for days, the remaining toxins broke down almost completely, until what was left was safe. None of this was quick or easy. It took days of labor and generations of trial and error. Nobody involved had a word for chemistry, or toxicology, or genetics. But through thousands of years of quietly selecting the least bitter tubers from each harvest and replanting only those, Andean farmers were practicing all three anyway, by hand, by instinct, without ever knowing the science behind what they were doing. By the time the Inca rose to power across western South America around the 1400s, they had inherited something extraordinary, a crop the rest of the world didn't even know existed yet, refined over 8 millennia into a genuine agricultural marvel. Inca farmers didn't just grow potatoes, they engineered an entire science around them. On terraced fields carved into the mountains around Cusco, they cultivated more than 3,000 distinct varieties. Bright yellow, deep purple, blood red, some nearly black. Each matched precisely to a specific altitude, soil, and microclimate. This wasn't casual subsistence farming. It was precision agriculture, centuries before anyone had that phrase. And the Inca solved a problem that would stump European farmers for 200 more years. Long-term storage. Without refrigeration, a fresh potato rots within weeks. Their solution was a freeze-dried product called chuño, potatoes frozen solid overnight in the Andean cold, then walked over barefoot the next morning as the sun warmed the ground, squeezing out the moisture. Repeated over several days, this left behind a light, chalky, bone-dry block that weighed almost nothing and could be stored for 5 years, 8 years, sometimes 10 or more, without ever spoiling. Chuño fed Inca armies on long campaigns, sustained cities through lean harvest years, and was so central to daily life that the Inca measured travel distance partly by how much chuño a traveler needed to carry. This wasn't a side dish. It was the invisible infrastructure underneath one of the largest empires the pre-Columbian Americas ever produced. And then the Spanish arrived, and almost none of that mattered to them at all. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 1530s, they were hunting gold and silver, and they found staggering amounts of both. The potato, the crop, an entire empire had been quietly engineered around for centuries, barely registered as an afterthought. It was ugly. It grew buried in dirt. Nobody was melting it down or shipping it home in a treasure fleet. A handful of tubers eventually made it back to the Iberian Peninsula around 1570, with no fanfare at all, no royal announcement, no celebration. They were handed to sailors as cheap anti-scurvy rations and donated to hospitals and monasteries as food for the poor and the sick, which tells you almost everything about where this crop sat in the European mind from day one. It wasn't food for anyone who mattered. That indifference might have been a fairly minor historical footnote if Europe had simply continued to ignore the potato from there. Instead, over the following century, plain indifference curdled into something much closer to outright fear. Here's what you need to understand about Europe in the late 1500s. Bread was sacred. Wheat, barley, oats, rye. These grew upward, reaching toward the sun, and to deeply religious societies that mattered enormously. Bread was treated as a literal gift from God. Entire economies, entire feudal systems, entire civilizations were structured around grain. The potato broke every one of those rules, and it did so visibly. It grew in the dark, underground, hidden from the sun entirely. It was lumpy and misshapen, covered in strange little growths people called eyes. And worse than any of that, it belonged to the nightshade family, the same botanical family as one of Europe's most notorious poisonous plants. To people living in deeply superstitious, deeply religious societies, that wasn't dismissed as a harmless botanical coincidence. It was read as a warning. What followed sounds almost invented, except none of it is. France's city of Besançon formally banned potato cultivation in 1596 on the grounds that it caused leprosy. The Russian Orthodox Church branded it the devil's apple, preaching that eating one was a sin against God. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, people blamed potatoes for scrofula, flatulence, and what one writer delicately called uncontrollable desire. And in Scotland, some Presbyterian clergy refused to eat potatoes on purely theological grounds. The word potato appears nowhere in Scripture, so God could never have intended it as human food. Not an exaggeration, a documented argument made in earnest from real pulpits. For nearly 200 years, the potato mostly sat in European gardens as a curiosity, not a crop. Wealthy households grew it purely for its purple and white flowers. Marie Antoinette reportedly wore the blossoms in her hair at court. Scholars wrote entire papers seriously debating whether the thing was edible, medicinal, or outright dangerous. But actually eating the potato as a regular part of your diet? That was considered beneath the dignity of anyone with real social standing. It was treated as livestock feed at best, and a mark of desperate poverty at worst. In England, even the poorest labourers considered it a genuine insult to be offered potatoes instead of bread. The class distinction was unmistakable. Bread meant civilization. Potatoes meant you had failed at it. For a crop with the potential to feed an entire continent, this was a remarkably slow, humiliating start. It took a war, a food shortage of its own, and two unusually stubborn men to finally change that. Frederick the Great of Prussia, who ruled from 1740 to 1786, had a very practical problem on his hands. His kingdom kept getting dragged into brutal wars with its neighbours, and invading armies loved burning wheat fields to starve out the local population into surrender. Grain sitting exposed in an open field is an easy target. You simply set it on fire and watch it burn. A crop growing 6 inches underground, completely hidden beneath the soil, is a dramatically harder target. An enemy army could march right across a potato field without ever realizing dinner was buried beneath their boots. In 1756, Frederick issued the Kartoffelbefehl, the potato order, commanding peasants to plant the crop under threat of punishment. They complied reluctantly and made their opinion known. Villagers in Kolberg reportedly told the king the crop had no smell, no taste, and that not even dogs would eat it. So Frederick tried something considerably smarter than threats. According to legend, he planted a royal potato garden on the outskirts of Berlin and stationed uniformed soldiers around its perimeter in plain public view. The logic barely needed to be spoken aloud. If the king himself required armed guards to protect these plants, they had to be worth something extraordinary. Sure enough, local peasants began sneaking into the royal garden under cover of night to steal seed potatoes for their own fields, precisely the outcome, according to the story, that Frederick had engineered all along. Within a single generation, the potato had become a genuine staple crop across Prussia and much of northern Germany. Meanwhile in France, a former army pharmacist named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier was fighting a similar battle with far more theatrical flair. Captured by Prussian forces during the 7 Years' War, he spent 3 years as a prisoner of war eating almost nothing but potatoes. He didn't die, didn't lose his mind, and came home healthier than many French soldiers who'd stayed on standard rations, and that fact stayed with him. After returning to France, Parmentier dedicated the better part of the next several decades of his life to a single, almost obsessive mission: convincing the French people to eat potatoes by any means necessary. He hosted elaborate dinner parties for Parisian high society, where every course, from appetizer to dessert, was made entirely from potato. He presented potato blossoms directly to King Louis XVI, who reportedly tucked one into his buttonhole and wore it around the palace grounds. He convinced Queen Marie Antoinette to wear the flowers in her hair at court, turning the potato blossom into an actual fashion statement. And then he borrowed a page directly from Frederick's playbook. Parmentier planted a large potato field in the sandy, relatively poor soil of the Sablons Plain outside Paris, posted armed guards around it during daylight hours to make it look valuable and important, and then conveniently withdrew those same guards every single night, so that curious Parisians would sneak in and steal the plants themselves. It worked exactly as it had in Prussia. By the late 1700s, France had finally genuinely accepted the potato as legitimate human food. France still honors him for it. The classic French dish, hachis parmentier, essentially a French take on shepherd's pie, carries his name to this day. There's a Paris metro station named after him, along with a boulevard and a hospital. A man spent his life campaigning for a root vegetable, and France, in return, gave his name back to history. But while France and Prussia were slowly winning the potato over through royal theatre and clever public relations, something far more dangerous was quietly building on the island of Ireland. Because there, the potato wasn't. A novelty being marketed to a skeptical public. It was rapidly becoming the only thing standing between millions of people and outright starvation. Under British rule, most Irish farmland was owned by English and Anglo-Irish landlords who often never set foot on the estates they controlled. Irish Catholic tenant farmers worked tiny plots of increasingly poor, waterlogged soil with no ownership and no protection from eviction, squeezed onto smaller fragments of marginal ground by generations of restrictive British policy. The potato was almost perfectly suited to this brutal arrangement. A single acre could feed a family of 6 for a year. No other crop came close. It grew in soil too poor for wheat, thrived in Ireland's damp climate, and needed no plough, no horse, no mill, just a spade, seed potatoes, and rain. Combined with buttermilk, it formed a diet complete enough to sustain life indefinitely. And it worked on a genuinely staggering scale. Ireland's population nearly tripled between 1700 and 1840, climbing from roughly 3 million people to more than 8 million, growth that the potato, essentially by itself, made possible. But buried inside that extraordinary success was a catastrophic structural flaw, one that anyone with real agricultural knowledge could have seen coming from miles away. Nearly every potato grown in Ireland belonged to a single variety, known as the Irish lumper. Not a wide spread of varieties the way the Inca had once cultivated across the Andes, just one. Genetically, every field in every county across the entire country was essentially identical to every other field, which meant that any single disease capable of killing one potato plant was, by definition, capable of killing every single potato plant in Ireland simultaneously, with no genetic diversity left in reserve and absolutely no backup plan. In the late summer of 1845, a water mold called Phytophthora infestans arrived in Europe, most likely carried in a shipment of potatoes from the Americas. It thrived in exactly the cool, damp conditions that define the Irish climate for most of the year. The blight tore through Belgium first, then the Netherlands, then England, and then, finally, it reached Ireland. The destruction was almost instantaneous. Fields that looked perfectly healthy at sunrise were black, wilted, and collapsing into rot by sunset. Farmers dug desperately into the soil, hoping to salvage something, only to discover the tubers underneath had already turned to foul, blackened pulp. In counties like Mayo, Galway, and Clare, the smell of decaying potatoes hung so thick in the air that people tied cloth over their faces just to walk past an infected field. The first year alone would have qualified as a serious, deadly famine on its own. What turned it into a generational catastrophe was that the blight simply kept coming back. In 1846, worse than the year before, again in 1847, again in 1848. Families with no other meaningful source of food began dying in their homes, on roadsides, in ditches beside the very fields where their crops had failed. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery tore through a population already weakened to the point of collapse by sustained hunger. Entire villages across Western Ireland were emptied out completely, their populations dead or gone. By the time it was finally over, roughly 1 million Irish people had died of starvation and the diseases that followed close behind it. Another 1 million fled the country entirely, many aboard those same overcrowded, disease-ridden coffin ships, where passengers died by the dozens during Atlantic crossings and were thrown overboard. Ireland's population dropped by nearly a quarter in under a decade, and remarkably, nearly 180 years later, it has still never fully recovered that original number. Britain's official response made an already horrific situation worse. Throughout the famine, Ireland continued exporting grain, butter, and livestock to England under armed military escort, even as its own people starved by the roadside. Relief programs that existed were slow, underfunded, and often tied to degrading conditions. Starving men performed brutal labor building roads to nowhere for wages too small to buy food that was rapidly becoming unaffordable. This was not purely a natural disaster. It was a natural disaster made dramatically, deliberately worse by political indifference and specific policy choices made in London. The famine didn't just devastate Ireland internally, it scattered the Irish people across the entire English-speaking world into Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Liverpool, Glasgow, Toronto, Melbourne, carrying with them a deep, generational anger toward British rule that would go on to fuel Irish nationalist movements for the better part of a century, eventually contributing to Irish independence in 1922. Here's the part of this story that tends to catch people off guard. The famine didn't destroy the potato's reputation. If anything, it proved, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly how indispensable the crop had become to the modern world, and it taught agricultural science a permanent hard-won lesson about the danger of relying on a single genetic variety for an entire food supply. Plant breeders across Europe and the Americas began deliberately developing blight-resistant strains. Formal seed diversity and preservation programs followed not long after. The very disaster that nearly destroyed Ireland became the direct foundation of modern, scientific potato farming. The crop kept spreading. Russia had resisted it violently for decades. The 1840s saw actual potato riots, villages burning government-mandated fields and attacking the officials sent to plant them. But by the early 1900s, Russia had become one of the largest potato producers on Earth, giving it an affectionate nickname, the second bread. In China, the potato remained a minor curiosity for centuries after its introduction, until farmers in mountainous provinces like Yunnan and Sichuan discovered it could thrive where rice and wheat couldn't. Today, China is the single largest potato producer on the planet. India followed a strikingly similar trajectory, and now ranks second. Across the East African highlands, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, the potato found a natural home in cool highland climates throughout the 20th century, and international food security organizations now consider it one of the single most effective tools available for fighting hunger and malnutrition in the developing world. Today, the potato ranks as the fourth most important food crop on the entire planet, trailing only wheat, rice and corn. With more than 300 million metric tons grown across upwards of 150 countries very single year. The sheer scale of what humanity now does with this crop would have been genuinely unimaginable to an Inca farmer tending a terraced field above Cusco. And the story doesn't stop at food. Potato starch today shows up in manufacturing across paper, textiles, adhesives, and biodegradable plastics. During the Second World War, when Japan's advance across Southeast Asia cut off natural rubber supplies entirely, German industrial chemists figured out how to convert potato starch into synthetic rubber for military vehicle tires. Potato derivatives turn up in pharmaceuticals, in cosmetics, in animal feed, even in the adhesive on the back of a standard postage stamp. This root vegetable isn't just feeding the world. In a very literal sense, it's holding parts of the industrial world together. And then, in 1995, the potato became the first vegetable ever successfully grown in outer space. NASA and the University of Wisconsin cultivated potato plants aboard the space shuttle Columbia as part of ongoing research into what future long-duration space missions might one day require. If humanity ever establishes permanent colonies on the Moon or Mars, agricultural scientists widely expect the potato to be among the very first crops planted there, for essentially the same reasons Andean farmers valued it 8,000 years ago. It grows in poor, mineral-heavy soil where little else survives. It produces more calories per acre than almost any grain crop on Earth. It requires comparatively little water. It stores exceptionally well under harsh conditions. Sit with that. A crop the Spanish considered beneath their notice. A crop France officially blamed for leprosy. A crop Russia's church branded the devil's fruit. Is now humanity's leading candidate to become the first food grown on another planet. It started as a small, bitter, faintly poisonous weed clinging to bare rock above the clouds in South America. Indigenous farmers spent thousands of years quietly transforming it into something extraordinary. The Inca built an empire on top of it. The Spanish ignored it completely. Europe feared it, banned it, and mocked it for 2 straight centuries. A Prussian king and a French pharmacist dragged it into acceptance through nothing more than persistence and theatre. It fueled the explosive growth of an entire nation. And when it failed, just once, it very nearly erased that same nation from the map. Not bad, for a lumpy root vegetable that nobody ever wanted in the first place. That's the story of the plant sitting in almost every kitchen on Earth right now. One that spent 2 centuries being called poisonous, sinful, and unfit for God-fearing people, before quietly becoming one of the reasons civilization eats at all. If you're new here, this is Brand Ancestry. Every video, we dig into the hidden history behind the everyday things nobody thinks to question. If that's the kind of rabbit hole you enjoy, subscribe and stick around for the next one. And I want to know, out of everything in this video, the Inca Chunyo process, the Scottish Bible argument, Frederick's fake guards, or the famine itself, which part actually surprised you most? Drop it in the comments below. I read everyone. See you in the next one.